Hi, my name is Seth, and I'm on the Scala compiler team at Lightbend. We share responsibility for Scala with the Scala Center in Switzerland and with Martin's research group. I've been working on the team for about 3 years. I'm from Chicago originally and live here now. This talk is called You Are a Scala Contributor. If you aren't yet, I assume you're here because you're thinking you might like to be. You can be, and the theme today is to tell you and show you how. Being a Scala contributor it isn't a big deal. So everyone starts small on this. If you open an issue, if you comment on an issue or someone else's pull request, if you make your own pull request, even if it's just fixing a typo, then you are a Scala contributor. I say everyone started small. This is a little embarrassing, but I'll show you my own modest beginnings on this. This was in 2008. I'd spotted a typo in an error message, so I opened a ticket on it. I wasn't a committer. There was no GitHub, so it wasn't like I could just fix it myself. So I opened the ticket, and Martin fixed it the same day. That was exciting. It's a bit of a lesson for, it's like, what else can I make Martin do just by opening? So that it's a lesson for open source maintainers, I think, that be nice to people who show up with these little contributions, because there's a good chance that they'll stick around. Okay, so it is 2018 now, and contributing to open source is vastly easier than it was 10 years ago. It's really, the advent of GitHub has been like night and day for open source. So in all of the Scala venues that we offer for contributors, your GitHub login is your identity. So not only for issues and pull requests, but also for the Scala chat rooms and forums. We have a special chat room and a special forum, especially for contributors. So if you're working on a contribution or just interested in getting involved and have questions about what to do and how to go about it, these are the main two places to go for help. Gitter, there's chat technology. Maybe everyone knows this by now. It's either web-based, or you can get a desktop or mobile app. A little newer and less established is we switched from Google Groups to Discourse for both of our forums. We have one for users, one for contributors. That's web-based, but you can also choose to get the messages by email. If you need help or have a question, I've arranged the three main ways of getting help in ascending order of how formal they are. Ascending order of how much effort that they require from you, and also ascending order of how likely you are to get a response. Feelings are sort of divided on chat. Like a lot of people really love chat as a way of getting involved, and other people don't see the point. But when chat is good, it's really good. Like you go on there, you ask your question, and almost instantly you have an answer, or you're having a conversation with somebody. If you go on the Scala contributors chat and don't get an answer right away, or if a bunch of other stuff scrolls your question off the screen, please don't get discouraged. That's normal, and consider moving on either to the discussion forum, or just go ahead and open a pull request. I think different open source communities are maybe a little different about this, and the policy in Scala is that it is totally okay to open a pull request, even if it's not done, even if you're not even sure if what you're doing is a good idea. it's totally fine. Open a pull request, and you will definitely get help getting it across the finish line. Particularly if you're explicit about where you're stuck and what kind of help you could use. So in a way, I've jumped ahead a little bit to the point where you're already like submitting pull requests. I want to back up a little bit first and help you get oriented in terms of what's even out there for you to consider working on, where to find things, where to open issues, and so forth. All of the official Scala stuff, or almost all of it, is in one of these three GitHub organizations. So the Scala organization is stuff that is shared responsibility between Lightbend and the other groups involved. That's where the main Scala repo is. There are also important repos under the Scala Center organization, and then one extremely important repo under LAMP EPFL. That's the name of Martin's research group at EPFL in Lausanne, and so that's where Dottie is. Dottie, which will become Scala 3 before long. Under the Scala organization, you'll find two repos for the Scala websites. It's not always obvious when you go to the Scala website that there's actually two of them, because the designs are coordinated, so you won't necessarily notice if you've left scalalane.org and moved to docs.scalalane.org. But as a contributor, you'll need to be aware of how things are divided up. The main repo is downloads, the blog, getting started information, upcoming events. It's a fairly small repo where everything is expected to be really high quality and really up to date. And then docs.scalalane is where more in-depth technical documentation lives. It's where the tour of Scala lives. And it's just generally bigger and messier. There's more of a spectrum of things which are well maintained and things which are less well maintained. The Scala compiler itself and the standard library and the language specification are all together in the main Scala repo. It's a bit surprising that there are no issues in that repo. That came about for historical reasons. We used to use Jira for issue tracking, and we wanted to import those issues into GitHub without losing the numbers, which are surprisingly important as identifiers that people actually know. So the issue numbers overlapped with the pull request numbers in the main repo. We had to put it separate. So you can go looking for bugs in Scala bug. There's no code there. You may also see references to tickets in Scala dev, which is another repo that has no code, only issues. It's admittedly confusing for people, sort of why it's split up and where to look for something. The two main differences are one is that Scala Dev is used primarily by the core team and by people who we work with routinely, who are like regulars. And then the other difference is that Scala Dev is really supposed to be about tracking current work in progress, and Scala Bug is like a historical record of issues that were found in published Scala releases. There's a helpful feature on GitHub, which I think is maybe not as well known as it should be, which is organization-wide search. If you go onto GitHub and go up in the search box, one of the choices is search this organization. So that's extremely helpful if you're not sure where the thing you're looking for might live. Is it an issue or a pull request? Already you're in two different repos. So Org-wide search, hugely useful. Also under the Scala organization are the Scala modules. These are separate libraries which are kind of part of the standard library and kind of not, right? So they're under the Scala organization, so that they have some official status, but they're separate jars and are separately maintained. The group that I've listed on the top are primarily maintained by us at Lightbend and by the whole Scala effort, although of course community participation is essential and welcome. The bottom group are modules that have now been spun off farther and are community maintained. So we on the Scala team sort of advise and give input, but there are community maintainers who are making the decisions about releases and doing the publishing and so forth. There's a hope of slimming down the Scala standard library even further and making some more modules. There's a ticket link there if you're interested in doing that kind of work. So that concludes the survey part of like what's out there. And now I'm going to circle back and talk about the contents of those repos in a little more detail and about what working on them looks like. And I'll do it in ascending order of how easy these repos are to get started in. So, and the starting point for that is the Scala websites. Even if you're quite new to Scala, even if you're still learning the language, there are still opportunities to do website work where you're valuable. In fact, having a kind of beginner perspective on Scala is actually really useful for doing this work. Like you can see things that aren't clear that those of us who've been doing for Scala for years are just blind to because we're so used to it. There are plenty of open issues in these repos. Some of them are technical, so having to do with the site generator and with CSS. If you have web skills, that's useful, and there are opportunities there. There are also plenty of tickets that are about content, either content that's poor quality or needs updating, or ideas for content that's missing. So if you have some writing and editing skills, that's needed as well. So is translation. In particular, the tour of Scala is something that we try to offer in every language imaginable. If you're interested in either updating existing translations of the tour or doing new ones, that would be fantastic. I think there are about a dozen currently. Working in the website repos, the easiest way to do it, if you're fixing a typo or doing light edits, you can just do it directly in the GitHub web UI. The pages on the doc site have a link to the page on GitHub where the source for that page is stored. If you're doing work that's a little more in-depth, or if you need to preview the work locally before sending your pull request, then these are the steps. Clone the repo. Both of the websites are built using a static site generator called Jekyll, which is pretty standard for GitHub-based projects. These two commands are basically the only thing that I know about Ruby, but this should be it should be enough for you to build the site locally and get a live preview that will show your edits as you make them. If you're looking at the issues, keep an eye out for the labels on the issue, in particular this label Good First Issue. So in the last couple of years, this has become increasingly standard on GitHub that open source projects that are looking to make things easier for people to get started will label issues as good first issue. So we are using that label in the website repos as well as in the other repos that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so moving on now from the websites to the Scala modules. There's actually not a lot to say about the modules specifically, which is good news. So one of the reasons to spin them off from the standard library was exactly to make working on them easier. So the Scala modules are ordinary libraries. They're built with the usual tools that are common, that are near universal now for Scala open source projects. They're built with SBT. There's CI via Travis, and the tests are usually with either Scala test, Scala check, or both. Because these are separate modules, they're not tied to the Scala release schedule. New versions of the modules can be built and shipped anytime, including quickly if needed, which is almost never the case with Scala itself. Okay, moving on now to the main Scala repo. As I mentioned, there's several different kinds of content in that repo. The language specification is there. The Scala doc for the standard library is there, of course, mixed in with the actual code for the standard library. And then the compiler lives there as well. This is a sample month of data from earlier this year that shows, well, I guess you'd have to know who these user icons are, but I added this up, and the majority of contributions were actually from outside contributors. So it's, there's kind of a spectrum of programming languages, from languages that have huge companies behind them, funding large teams to work on them, and there are languages that are purely volunteer and open source. Scala is really a lot closer to the volunteer open source end of that spectrum. Lightbend is a small company, and the Scala Center is fairly small as well. So I showed this slide for two reasons. One is to emphasize that Scala needs you. If it was just us at Lightbend doing this, then Scala would die. And the other reason is just to show that contributing in this repo has worked out really well for a lot of people. And I would like to think, and I actually do think, that the activity has really picked up in the last 2 years or so. I think moving to an SBT-based build especially really made it a lot easier for people to help out. Until about 2 years ago, we were still building with Ant, which was kind of a nightmare. The other thing that has really helped is the advent of Travis. That's been another game changer for open source in general in the last few years. Okay, so if you're interested in the language specification, that's a fairly specialized interest, but it's an interest that some people do have. Issues on the specification itself are in Scala bug. There's a label for that. The kind of work on the spec that we would most love to have someone step up and do some of is merging accepted Scala improvement process proposals into the spec. This is supposed to happen after a proposal has been accepted and implemented, and generally has not happened. So that's a kind of a bite-sized chunk of work on the spec that it's possible for people to do. Usually the proposals are expected to already be written in the same kind of technical prose that is used in the spec. So it's not a big writing job. It's more a matter of sort of taking the SIP apart and finding out where to stick all the pieces of it. The tools on the spec are Markdown and Jekyll, just as in the website's MathJax for formulas. There's a separate README if you're interested in spec work. For the other kind of contents of the repo, the library and compiler, the top-level READMEs apply. There's 2 of them for no reason. There's really no rhyme or reason to like what's in one versus the other, so you just have to read or at least skim both. The easiest part of the standard library to work on is, of course, the doc comments. In order to work on that, you need to learn a little bit of Scala doc syntax. This is not something that requires a lot of study. Basically, everyone just looks at all the existing examples and imitates them. And as we'll see on the next slide, you do need to use SBT, but you basically only need to know one SBT command, which is the standard one. After you've cloned the repo and made changes to the sources, you run SBT and then run the doc command in the library subproject. And that'll generate the HTML for you to view in your browser. We generally don't have issues typically reported on missing or poor quality Scala doc. So if you'd like to do Scala doc, it's more up to you to identify things that need work. So I encourage you to, as you're looking things up yourself in the standard library, to kind of set aside a part of your brain to notice whether the documentation needs work. For working on the code of the standard library, again, we're still in a zone where the level of difference from working on any Scala, any SBT-based Scala open source project are pretty small. The main area where this is unusual is in testing. Because Scala is, Scala itself, we can't really have dependencies within this repo. We can't have Scala-based dependencies because those would be circular. We actually did make one exception to that, which is that we took on Scala check as a circular dependency, and we were willing to pay the cost in that case because we think that generative testing, property-based testing is like so important to have. If you're not doing property-based testing, then normal standard library tests should just be written with JUnit. In the Scala repo, there's a bespoke testing tool unique to this one repo called partest. If you're doing standard library work, you probably don't need to learn much about partest because any new tests that you write should not be partest based, but you may find yourself needing to update existing tests that were written in partest in like the old days. When you're working in the standard library, often performance is just as much of a concern as correctness. If you're not sure whether your pull request needs benchmarking, it's fine to assume that it doesn't and just submit it and then either ask or see if it's requested. If it is deemed performance sensitive, there's a directory under the test directory called benchmarks. It has its own README and its own benchmarking harnesses, so that if you do need to benchmark a change that you've done, it's actually rather easy. So finally, the compiler itself. So reaching we're now at the end of our ascent into subjects requiring more and more effort and ramp up time. There is definitely not enough room in this talk for me to really to get into depth on compiler issues. So I'll give you a few practical tips and then also point you towards further learning resources. I mentioned par test. Most of the compiler tests are par test based, and it means you have a little bit of learning to do, but it's actually primarily good news because it's unique to this repo. It's like heavily customized to be really convenient for doing compiler testing. It's typically we run a subset of the test suite locally because the whole thing takes a long time to run. So you sort of get halfway confident that your change is good, and then just send the pull request in and let CI do the dirty work. For learning about compiler internals, my number one recommendation, not only for learning, but even just for getting interested in the subject, is this video by Jason Zog from a couple years ago called Scala C Survival Guide. So this is, it's not a lecture, it's all Jason in the REPL right from the start, showing you how to interactively explore compiler internals and see what the compiler is doing with your code. So it's all hands-on. I think it's a fascinating talk. The other like must-see or must-read in this case is Eugene Burmako's Scala Hacker Guide. This is unfortunately starting to get kind of out of date, so updating it is actually something that we could use some help with as well. This walks you through the entire process of making a change to the compiler from beginning to end. It's very detailed and well done. You'll want to learn what phases exist in the compiler. There's a flag that will print out a little reference card of that. And my single favorite compiler thing for playing and exploring is this xprintall flag. You can run any piece of Scala code you want through this, and it will show how the code looks at every stage of its transformation as it goes through each phase of the compiler. It's really awesome. I strongly suggest using IntelliJ for compiler work, even if you're an IDE skeptic and a debugger skeptic, as I am myself. Everyone who does the heavy work on the compiler uses IntelliJ and considers it essential to their productivity. IntelliJ works fine on both the compiler and the standard library. Even if you don't want to edit or build or run your code with IntelliJ, you can also attach the IntelliJ debugger to any running JVM that you've started with the debugger flags enabled. That's incredibly useful for troubleshooting compiler stuff. If you're looking for an easy way to get started, working on errors and warnings is a really good getting started task. Also, other kinds of work, anything you do with Scala reflection, any macros that you write. If you write a compiler plugin, I have a separate talk about how to do that. The APIs that you're using for all of those tasks are the exact same APIs that you use in compiler work. So it is compiler work. It is training you to do compiler changes. So far, I've talked only about Scala 2. I'm sure at least some of you have been wondering about working on Scala 3. I'll start by reminding you that the theme for Scala 2.14, which we'll be starting work on soon now that 2.13 is nearing completion, the theme for Scala 2.14 is to align with Dottie and to prepare for Scala 3. So by the time Scala 2.14 is done, Scala 2.14 and Scala 3 will have a lot in common. They already have the same standard library, and that will continue. They already share the final phase of the compiler. The bytecode generator is shared. The work on Tasty will enable Scala 2 and 3 to share the same library ecosystem. And we're also, on the compiler part, we're looking to make more of the later phases in the compiler be shared. The ideal goal would be that really the only difference between the two compilers is that it would be the type checker. At that point, we would emit tasty, and the Dotty backend would take over. That's an ambitious goal. I don't know if we'll get there for Scala 2.14, but we can definitely at least get a lot of the way there. So so work on Scala 2 is work on Scala 3. If you're working on Scala 2, you're helping Scala 3 happen. Nonetheless, I definitely wouldn't want to discourage you from from making the jump now and working on Scala 3 directly. I don't have a lot of specific advice about that for you because it's something that I haven't done myself. But here are links for where the code is, where the issues are, and where the chat room is. The Dotty project is heavily GitHub based, so they don't use Discourse much. The issues tracker and pull requests are like this crazy mix of, I fixed a typo all the way up to like, here is this major new feature for Scala 3. What do you think? It's a tough repo to follow because there's so much sort of small noise concealing the like really big things you want to read, but worth following anyway. Okay, in a longer version of this talk, I go on and talk about deciding what to work on and how to stay motivated. So my talk slot here is a little shorter. I don't really have time to go into that too much, but because I want to leave a few minutes for questions. But you can find these slides online afterwards, and I have lots of advice about decision process on where to work on. I have specific suggestions on things that Scala needs help with, and a lot of advice about how to stay motivated. I'll pick just one bullet to show from the how to stay motivated, which is the most important thing is to understand that open source work is slow. It's going to, occasionally you have this great experience in chat where you get an answer right away, but it's more common that the path that your pull request will take to being merged will have multiple delays that that can last days. So fire up more than one thing so you're never feeling stuck when one is delayed. Thank you for listening. Are there any questions? Nobody. Yes.
How much background do you need to construction, especially to the process that you
Okay, so the question is, in order to do compiler work, how much education in compilers do you need, and how much does it matter how recent that education is? If you want to work on the type checker, then it would be best to be one of Martin's PhD students. The rest of the compiler is just not that hard. Parsing is not that hard, but it's also not like an area of activity. The later phases of the compiler are complicated, but some of them, most of the challenges that you will face are simply challenges of learning this specific code base, rather than challenges of like, I don't even know what these concepts are, or oh, I should have learned this in school. I mean, it would help to have done maybe a quarter or a semester of compilers as an undergrad, but I would say education beyond that level is not that important, and the how recent that education is not important at all. Time for one more question? Okay, the question is, when is lunch? Lunch is now. Thanks.